My name is Daniel. I'm 32 years old, and by most accounts, I live a life that barely leaves a ripple. I work in office, spend too much time staring at spreadsheets, and take the same public transport home every evening. My life is predictable, orderly, maybe even boring. That's why, for years, I never thought twice about catching the night bus. But there's one ride I'll never forget. The one that didn't just break the routine, it shattered it. Looking back now, I think that night may have saved my life, though it never felt like that at the time. It happened late in November, on one of those nights where the air feels thin and sharp, as if winter's fingers are already scratching at the city's windows. I'd stayed late at work, not out of ambition, but necessity. A client meeting had dragged on, stretching far past normal hours. By the time I finally stepped out of the office, it was 11:45 p.m. The streets had thinned to a few lonely figures in coats, heads down against the cold. Street lamps buzzed faintly, casting pale orange halos on the wet pavement. A bakery on the corner had already turned its sign to closed, but the smell of bread still clung to the air like a ghost. A convenience store stood across the street, its flickering fluorescent lights making the whole block look tired. I shoved my hands deeper into my coat pockets and quickened my pace toward the bus stop. The 47 was the only route left running at this hour, and if I missed it, I'd have to walk nearly an hour home through half-lit streets. I made it just as the bus pulled up, hissing to a stop. The warm breath of diesel exhaust rolled over me, tinged with the faint metallic tang of the city at night. I tapped my transit card, gave the driver a polite nod, and stepped inside, expecting the usual quiet ride. I had no way of knowing that by the time I reached my stop, if I reached it at all, I'd be a different man. The doors closed behind me with a hollow hiss, sealing me into the bus's warm, stale air. The familiar scent of diesel hung heavy, but there was something else underneath it tonight, a damp, musty smell, the kind that clings to forgotten basements. It was the kind of odor that doesn't just sit in the air, it seeps into your clothes, your hair, your thoughts. The dim overhead lights flickered twice before steadying, casting long shadows across the scuffed floor. I noticed right away that the bus was emptier than usual. At the very front sat an elderly woman bundled in a thick scarf, her hands clasped tightly around a worn leather purse. She stared straight ahead, as if afraid that if she looked around, she might see something she'd rather not. A few rows behind her, two teenagers occupied opposite ends of the same seat, not quite sitting together, not quite apart. One had his hood up, the glow of his phone screen painting his face in cold light. The other bobbed his head faintly to whatever blared through his headphones, his foot tapping in an irregular rhythm. And then there was the man in the back. He sat dead center of the last row, the seat that gave him the widest view of the bus. His long coat was the kind of dark that seemed to swallow light, and the hood of it was drawn so far forward that his face was entirely hidden. His posture was unnervingly still, except for his hands. They rested on his knees, pale fingers twitching in small, quick movements. It wasn't random fidgeting. There was a rhythm to it. His thumb pressed against each fingertip in sequence, then again, faster and faster, like he was silently counting or running his hands along invisible beads. I picked a seat 3 rows ahead of him, close enough to the middle doors that I could get out quickly if I needed to, but far enough away that I wouldn't have to make eye contact. I told myself I was being paranoid, that he was probably just another tired commuter. But there was something about him, a density to the air around him, as if his presence bent the space slightly. The bus lurched forward, and the city lights began to slide past the windows. The rhythm of the ride, the soft growl of the engine, the occasional squeak of the brakes, usually calmed me. Tonight, it only made me hyper-aware of how few of us were here, and how the man in the back hadn't moved his head once since I got on. We rattled along for several minutes, the hum of the engine filling the silence between us. The city outside was quiet. No late-night traffic, no people lingering under street lamps. Just empty sidewalks and the occasional shuttered shop front gliding past in the darkness. The first stop came into view, a lonely shelter with a cracked plexiglass wall, its schedule taped inside and half covered by graffiti. The elderly woman in the front rose from her seat, gripping her purse like it might be snatched away at any second. The driver pulled up, the door's side open, and she shuffled off into the cold night without so much as glancing back. The doors closed again. The bus pulled away. The next stop was only a few minutes down the road. I knew the route well. I'd taken it hundreds of times before. But as we approached the dim glow of the next streetlight, the driver didn't slow down. My eyes flicked to the shelter, completely empty, and I figured maybe he just kept going because no one was waiting. Still, it felt odd. I happened to glance in the mirror mounted above the driver's seat. It was angled to show the entire bus, and in that warped reflection, I saw it happen. The man in the back leaned forward, his shoulders hunching. Slowly, almost deliberately, he tilted his head toward the driver and said something. I couldn't hear the words. It was more of a hiss than speech, but whatever it was, the driver didn't respond aloud. He simply kept driving. We blew past the next stop as if it wasn't there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was coincidence. But a prickling sensation had started to gather at the base of my neck. Something about the timing was too perfect. The man whispers, and we skip a stop. A few blocks later, another shelter came into view. Again, the man leaned forward. His head moved just slightly, a whisper, and we sailed past without slowing. This time, I didn't just feel uneasy. I felt watched. I turned slightly, as casually as I could, pretending to adjust my seat. His hood still hid his face, but I could tell, somehow, that his head was tilted in my direction now. The bus felt bigger now, the spaces between seats stretching in my mind like a hallway in a dream. The two teenagers had gotten off without me noticing exactly when, sometime in the blur between the last two skip stops. That left just me, the driver, and the man in the back. The absence of other passengers changed the atmosphere completely. Without idle chatter, phone notifications, or the rustle of bags, the silence became oppressive. The only sounds were the low, steady rumble of the engine and the occasional rattle of a loose panel somewhere near the ceiling. Every time the bus hit a bump, the fluorescent lights above flickered ever so slightly, casting shadows that seemed to shift in ways they shouldn't. I glanced up toward the convex mirror above the driver again. It reflected a wide, fisheye view of the aisle, and there he was still in the exact same seat. But his posture had changed. His head was no longer angled toward the driver. It was turned directly forward, directly toward me. I told myself not to overreact. Maybe he was just looking in my general direction, maybe not even at me at all. But my heartbeat had picked up, and the warm air from the vents suddenly felt stifling. I loosened my scarf, trying to breathe evenly, hoping the sound of my own anxiety wasn't as loud as it felt in my head. Another stop approached. This time, I forced myself to watch. As we neared the shelter, the man's hands twitched faster, his fingers pressing against his knees in that strange, counting rhythm. Then, without turning his hooded face away from me, he leaned forward, just slightly, and whispered something to the driver again. The words were too quiet for me to catch, but I swear the air in the bus felt heavier as soon as he spoke. The driver's head didn't move. He didn't acknowledge the whisper in any visible way. But once more, we cruised right past the stop without slowing down. It was only then that I realized something else. We weren't on the usual timetable anymore. By now, I should have been seeing the familiar neon sign of the late-night pharmacy near my neighborhood. Instead, the scenery outside was unfamiliar. Darker streets, fewer lights, almost no people. We were going deeper into the city, but not toward anywhere I recognized. The bus groaned as it turned sharply onto a street I didn't know. The pavement outside was rougher here, patched in places, and the street lamps were spaced farther apart. The glow they cast wasn't warm or welcoming. It was pale and sickly, making everything look washed out, like a faded photograph. I shifted in my seat, leaning closer to the window, trying to find a landmark. Nothing. No storefronts, no glowing signs, no open windows with the flicker of a late-night TV. Just closed shutters, blank facades, and the occasional alley that vanished into shadow. A knot of unease tightened in my chest. I knew this city. I'd lived here for years. Yet every block we passed felt alien, as if the streets had been rearranged when I wasn't looking. The man in the back was still watching me. I could feel it, the weight of it pressing into my shoulders. The glass in the window beside me reflected the faintest shape of him. A hood, still and dark, no sign of a face beneath. Another stop approached, or rather what looked like one. A single metal pole with a timetable bolted to it stood under the dim cone of a flickering lamp. There was no bench, no shelter, just the skeletal remains of what might once have been a regular stop. Again, his hands began their rapid, silent counting. Again, he leaned forward. The whisper this time was longer, drawn out. I couldn't hear the words, if they were words at all, but the sound made my skin crawl. It was like hearing water trickle somewhere in the walls of an old house. Faint, but constant enough to unsettle you. We didn't slow down. I finally decided to speak up. Hey, I called toward the driver, my voice louder than I intended in the silence. I think you missed a couple stops. The driver didn't answer. He didn't even glance in the mirror. His eyes were locked on the road ahead, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles looked pale under the dashboard light. The man in the back stopped moving his fingers. For a moment, I thought maybe he'd lost interest in me. But then I heard it, faint and deliberate, a slow, steady tapping on the back of the seat in front of him. Not random, but patterned. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Pause. And then, without any change in expression that I could see, he leaned just slightly to the side, as if to get a better view of my face. I turned back toward the window, trying to focus on the passing streets. But what I saw next made my breath catch. We weren't passing any streets at all, just the same stretch of road, repeating. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe the streets here all looked the same. The same cracked sidewalk, the same leaning lamppost, the same overflowing trash bin. Cities have patterns. Cities repeat. But the way the shadows fell, the way the graffiti curved over the shuttered metal shop front, the way a loose newspaper fluttered against the curb, always caught on the same broken bit of pavement, it wasn't just similar. It was identical. We were circling. I twisted in my seat and looked out the other side of the bus, hoping maybe the view there would be different, but it wasn't. The same alley mouth, the same faint smear of red paint on the wall, the same flicker in the lamppost above it, exactly in time, as if the entire world outside was stuck on a loop. I looked toward the driver again. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed unblinking on the road ahead. I opened my mouth to ask if he noticed, but something about his stillness stopped me. It wasn't just focus. It was restraint, like a man gripping the wheel not to guide the bus, but to hold himself in place. From a back, the tapping started again. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Pause. It was measured, steady, deliberate, almost like it was meant for me. I turned my head just enough to see him in the mirror. His hood had shifted slightly, revealing a sliver of his jaw, pale skin stretched tight over bone. His lips were moving, though no sound reached me. And his eyes, though I couldn't see them directly, seemed locked on mine through that warped reflection. Another stop appeared ahead, glowing under a single flickering light. For a moment, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was where I'd get off, loop or not. I shifted forward, ready to press the stop button. Then I saw her. A woman stood at the stop, or rather, the shape of one. She was motionless, her head tilted slightly downward, hair hanging like a curtain. Her skin, what little I could see of it, looked gray, not in the dim light way, but in the way of old photographs. The man in the back leaned forward sharply. His whisper this time wasn't soft, it was urgent. The driver's hands tightened further on the wheel, and we roared past without stopping. I caught one last glimpse of the figure as we passed. She hadn't moved an inch, and then the same street began again. By the 4th repetition of the same street, my nerves were raw. The bus had become a cage on wheels, its fluorescent lights buzzing like angry insects overhead. Every time we passed that broken lamppost, the gray-skinned woman was gone, but the memory of her still clung to me like static. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, gripping the seat back in front of me for balance as the bus rattled over a pothole, and made my way toward the driver. The man in the back didn't move, but I could feel his gaze sliding along my spine as I walked. I leaned over the yellow barrier behind the driver's seat. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're going in circles. I think you're lost. You've missed every stop for the last 20 minutes. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. His eyes stayed fixed forward, knuckles white on the wheel. Then, without looking at me, he said quietly, "Sit back down. Don't talk to him." "Don't talk to who?" I asked, though I already knew. The driver's jaw clenched. "The one in the back. Just stay quiet. And whatever you do, don't." His voice broke off as if someone had reached into his throat and pulled the words away. I glanced in the mirror and saw why. The man in the back was no longer seated. He was standing in the aisle, halfway between his seat and mine, hood still low, hands hanging loosely at his sides. His movements weren't threatening exactly, but they were deliberate, like he had all the time in the world to get to me. I backed away from the driver's seat, my heart pounding. The man stopped, tilting his head in that unnatural way, like a bird studying something shiny. For a long, heavy moment, none of us moved. The only sound was the deep hum of the engine and the squeal of the tires as we turned yet again onto the same street. And then, so softly I almost thought I imagined it, I heard him speak. Not to the driver. Not to himself. To me. "You don't belong here." My mouth went dry. The words hadn't been loud, but they carried a strange weight, like they had been placed directly into my head rather than spoken aloud. I forced myself to look toward the doors. The middle set was closer than the front, and for a second, I imagined myself pressing the emergency release, stepping off into the cold, and leaving this nightmare behind. I took one step toward them. The man in the back mirrored me. One step forward. It wasn't fast, it wasn't aggressive, but it was enough to tell me that if I kept moving toward the exit, so would he. And if I ran, I wasn't sure I'd make it off before he got there. I glanced outside as we passed the same familiar stretch of road. The broken lamppost flickered overhead. The gray-skinned woman was back. She stood exactly where she'd been before, head lowered, hair hanging forward. Only this time, her face was turned slightly toward the bus as it passed. I couldn't see her features clearly, but I could see her mouth. It was moving, slowly, silently, forming words I couldn't hear. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, my breath fogging it, as if somehow she could see me. But she didn't react. Her lips just kept shaping the same sound over and over again until we passed her and the loop swallowed her up once more. I turned back to the aisle. The man had stopped moving. He was just waiting. I thought about running to the driver, maybe forcing him to open the door, but the look on the driver's face stopped me cold. It wasn't fear anymore. It was resignation. I whispered, "Can't you just let me out?" His voice was low, almost lost under the engine's hum. "There's nowhere to get out to." I stared at him confused. "What are you talking about?" He finally looked at me, just for a second, and his eyes were the eyes of someone who'd been here far too long. "This road doesn't lead anywhere you know. It just takes you." Before I could ask what that meant, the man in the back took another step toward me, and the bus plunged into a darker stretch of road where even the lampposts didn't follow. The darkness outside was absolute. No streetlights, no buildings, not even the faint glow of a distant skyline. The windows had turned into black mirrors, reflecting only the pale interior of the bus. Me, the driver, and a man in the back. Except in the reflection, he was closer. I spun around. He was still several rows away, standing in the aisle, but in the glass he stood directly behind me, his hood so near it could almost brush my shoulder. I blinked hard, once, twice, and the reflection returned to normal. My stomach felt hollow. The driver gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles bloodless. "Don't listen to him," he said through clenched teeth. "I'm not." I began, but the man in the back cut me off. His voice was still low, but it rolled through the bus like a slow wave. "You can leave," he said. "All you have to do is say yes." The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. "Yes to what?" I asked before I could stop myself. He tilted his head again, the shadow of his hood shifting just enough for me to see the curve of a smile. "A trade." The word lingered in the air like smoke. I didn't want to ask more, but something in me, curiosity or fear, I couldn't tell, pushed it out anyway. "A trade for what?" "You for him." He nodded toward the driver without breaking his stare. One leaves. One stays. The driver's hands twitched on the wheel, and for the first time since I boarded, he looked back at me. His eyes were wide, pleading, but behind them was something else, guilt. The man in the back took another step forward. Say yes, and the road will open for you. Say no, and you'll ride until there's nothing left of you to ride. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. The bus hummed on in the dark, its tires whispering over pavement that shouldn't have been there at all. And then, in the reflection, I saw it again, the gray-skinned woman. Only now, she wasn't outside. She was sitting in the empty seat across from me. The woman's face was pale and cracked, like old porcelain left in the rain. Her eyes were dark voids, but somehow she fixed her gaze on me, piercing, unblinking, impossible to look away from. The bus seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in. The man in the back stopped inches from my seat, his breath cold on my skin despite the heater running. Say yes, he whispered again, voice like dry leaves rustling. Say yes, and you'll leave this endless ride behind. Say yes, and you'll step off into the world you remember. The driver's hand hovered near the door release, torn between hope and despair. I wanted to believe him, to believe I could escape this nightmare with a simple word. But something deep inside me recoiled. What happens if I say no? I asked, voice barely audible. The man's smile widened, a flicker of something ancient and cruel. You become part of the ride, he said. Endless miles, endless nights, until you're no longer you. Behind him, the gray woman shifted. Her cracked lips parted, and for the first time, I heard her voice, a rasp like the wind over dead leaves. Don't stay. The driver's eyes met mine, pleading silently. My mind raced. The endless loop, the haunted road, the silent whispers. Could I trust the man in the back? Could I trust the driver? Or the woman who had become part of the bus itself? My fingers trembled as I reached out and whispered a single word. Yes. The bus shuddered violently. The windows flared with blinding light, and the gray woman faded away, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. Goodbye. The bus slowed, the engine quieted, and the familiar streetlights of my neighborhood appeared ahead. The driver smiled faintly, nodding. I stepped off into the cold night, the city exactly as I remembered, but I was not the same. Because some roads don't just take you home. They change you forever.